Hi, my name is Joseph Pierce. I'm an associate professor at Stony Brook University, and I wanted to thank Seb Tortorici at NYU and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese there for inviting me to give this talk. And let's see, so this is a discussion of my book, Argentine Intimacies, Queer Kinship in an Age of Splendor, 1890 to 1910, which came out in 2019 with SUNY Press. There's the cover. At its core, Argentine Intimacies is about the paradoxes of kinship. It describes how political, economic, and cultural changes in Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries mobilized contradictory responses to what family meant, what it could mean, and for whom. In a broad sense, it is about the power of the family as an ideological framework and contradictory set of relational norms. It deals with the development of nationalism, the fear of social and demographic change, economic promise and decline, the relationship between normativity and queerness, and the intersections of sexuality, gender, race, and class. To approach these issues, I anchor this book in a particular place and time and on four related individuals. The Bunge siblings, Carlos Octavio, Julia Valentina, Alejandro, and Delfina, were part of a generation of 8. Carlos Octavio was a renowned social psychologist, Alejandro was a prominent economist, Julia was an educator and philanthropist, while Delfina wrote numerous books of poetry, memoirs, and essays. They were part of the network of landed elite that consolidated power over the course of the 19th century through strategic marriages, political alliances, and business savvy that came to be known as the Argentine oligarchy. And they were a family of writers who wrote about family. Before moving on, however, I want to pause briefly. The fact that we are connecting online now rather than in person is not something that I can gloss over. The quarantine is real. The debates over public hygiene and human and financial capital that we are currently witnessing across the world were also crucial in the late 19th century. In Argentina, a series of cholera and yellow fever epidemics between 1867 and 1871 led public officials to demand birth and death rates, but also policies to create hygienic urban infrastructure that could stem the flow of disease. This infrastructure aimed primarily at cleaning up the crowded colonial center where tenement housing structures, conventillos, had filled with Italian and Spanish immigrants. Quibbles over the costs of quarantining workers was fueled by a desire to project a vision of the nation as desirable for foreign capital investments and foreign laborers. These bodies and this capital were needed to expand the railroad, build a new port, what would later become Puerto Madero, and increase the capacity for exports. The question of how to balance the need for public safety and the economy is not new. The threat of intimate relations, touching, kissing, shaking hands in an era of contagion is not new. The institution of a biopolitical regime to administer the flow of bodies between spaces is also not new. The present moment in which state governments are turning to biometric data, geolocation technology, and thermal imaging to control the spread of COVID-19 is in fact predicated on the disciplinary architecture that emerged in the 19th century to manage populations, including the selective use of quarantines. So, for example, in 1887, a report from the president of the Departamento Nacional de Higiene, the hygiene department, proposed to build a lazaretto, a quarantine hospital, at the port of Buenos Aires. Similar facilities had been built outside of Philadelphia and New York City, that is at Ellis Island, to screen immigrants for contagious diseases. In 1887, the 1887 report includes the following recommendations. So here's a long quote. Quarantines, this is my translation, quarantines as they have been understood up until now should stop. They have to be replaced by other measures that are more practical, more scientific, more secure and economical, that allow the free circulation of that human tide that grows day after day and which we continually stimulate, only erecting those obstacles that guarantee their purity, their health, and the impossibility of transmitting to us their imported diseases, retaining what is contaminated, what is dangerous, and what is suspicious, but letting through what is new, what is beneficial, what is scientifically sterile from the point of view of contagion. In other words, the lazareto exterior, the outer lazaretto, as the Commission conceives it, should be the selective filter that stops all that is impure, but which allows free passage to what is convenient, inoffensive, and useful. The ruling class feared the illnesses that immigrants supposedly brought with them, the ideologies they espoused, the languages they spoke, the power that they could wield through collective action. But they also feared economic paralysis, fields left unplowed, salted beef left to spoil. Thus, a new filtration system, the lazaretto, to stop dangers and let through what was useful. Thus, the passage of civil marriage and a civic registry law that allowed the new National Hygiene Office to amass vital statistics and predict with ever more scientific certainty how much a life cost to hospitalize, to save, or let die. Thus, the standardization of the national education system, where immigrant children would be taught to love their new country. The generation of writers that I study in this book were members of the intellectual and political elite who sought to maintain dominance in this era. Carlos Octavio and Alejandro in particular were proponents of the social policies that rendered visible those contaminated and suspicious bodies so that they might be purged from the nation, so that Argentina could grow healthy and in the image of those very elite who saw themselves as a metonymical representation of the nation itself. But the elite was also keen to elide the rules that they set up for others. This is the question that motivates the book. How did they conjure the idealized family into existence? In what follows, I touch on two types of texts that show how that process worked: the diary and the photograph. So first, the diary. Julia and Delfina Bunge collaborated on what, to my knowledge, represents a unique coincidence in Argentine and even Latin American culture. They are sisters who simultaneously kept a diary for an extended period of time, shared, read, and commented on reading each other's diaries, and, though under different circumstances, published them subsequently. Delfina Bunge kept a diary from age 15 in 1897 until her death in 1952 at age 70, a voluminous archive of more than 10,000 handwritten and typed pages. Julia began her own journal in 1903 and wrote consistently until 1911, when, at least for a time, she gave up the practice. This text was eventually published by MSC in 1965 under the title Life, Marvelous Epoch, 1903 to 1911. Notably, MSC was also publishing the work of, among others, Jorge Luis Borges at this time, right? So it's not a small detail. Delfina's diary, in contrast, remained unpublished for decades until Lucia Galvez, a historian and Delfina's granddaughter, published a selection with commentary entitled Delfina Bunge, Diarios íntimos de una época brillante, with the multinational publishing house Planeta in the year 2000. So a bit about the diary. The diary is a queer genre. It does not require a plot to make sense. It signifies in the moment of and by virtue of the very act of writing. What is more, the diary need not even be writing. It may include paratexts as well as objects, clippings of hair, pressed flowers, correspondence, sketches. That is, it may function simultaneously as text and archive. Its voice is citational, filled with other voices, both collective and individual, characteristically heteroglossic. The diarist can relive previous moments by rereading the text, which doubles back and leaps forward in time. This iterative nature relies on the relation between time and the diarist, even if the writing is not necessarily constant. A day, a week, a year may pass between entries. With neither the benefit of hindsight nor the imperative to link particular life moments through a cohesive narrative, the diary is often incomplete, full of gaps, nonlinear, open-ended. But even if the diary may record the present, as it may reflect on the past, it always retains the possibility of a future. As Philippe Lejeune notes, quote, all journal writing assumes the intention to write at least one more time, an entry that will call for yet another one, and so on without end, end quote. Thus, the mode of the diary is dialogical and diachronic, but it always retains a sense of futurity. Those blank pages left to write point to more days, more writing, more life yet to record, a self in process. The Bunge sisters write each other and themselves in their mutually defining diaries, which reveal the self to be part of an ongoing historical and familial legacy, but also a relational construct. If the form of the diary, its structuring of rationality, defines the possibilities and limits of self-knowledge, then it also produces, rather than simply records, the self who writes. That is, its form influences the personal, affective, and cognitive relationships that emerge on its pages. This means, finally, that the diary is not simply a record of self, but as Foucault would put it, a technology of self-making. I should clarify that the archive that I am studying, these diaries, are not original manuscript diaries. In fact, Delfina copied by hand and later in typescript all of her own original diaries, a project of systematizing her notebooks that she began in 1928 and continued throughout her life. She actually refers to them as her cuadernos copia, her journal copies. This was a monumental undertaking, one that Delfina describes in an introductory page dated October of 1943. She says, I feel like I am leaving a terrible inheritance. And for whom? For my children, an obligation. But on the other hand, I think, once again, what something like this would have been for me, written by my mother in her youth or by my grandmother, it would have been of enormous interest. And then I think of Lucia, of Veronica, of other granddaughters who could come along, or grandsons. Among them, one of them might turn out like me, a fan of authentic diaries and intimate papers. And later, I say this is fun, but on the other hand, it does me violence. I have to hurt myself in order to copy things just as they are, when correcting them could improve so much. When I see that some term is lacking in those years of my youth to better express what I want, and that I couldn't find it then, and since it is so easy for me to add it now, I have to leave it like it is. The remedy to this pain are the notes that I add in red ink. So here you can see the palimpsest of the diary. This is an original page at the bottom. Can you see the mouse? This part here was the original that she cut out and then glued to the cuaderno copia. which she was copying by hand here and annotated in red. Here you can see the cover and the labeling that Delfina used, how she organized each volume. So this is diary number 4, 18 and 19 years old, from Rosario de la Frontera and Buenos Aires, 1900 to 1901. The quote that I read previously documents the labor that Delfina invests in organizing, copying, and not editing the diaries. It seems violent precisely because copying the text sparks her desire to perfect the narration of memory. She finds it difficult to relive this past without imagining even creating a different past. The effect of transcribing and not simply rereading the diary adds a layer of affective labor, of pain. More importantly, however, this is a project that Delfina carries out explicitly in the name of kinship. The Lucia that she mentions in the text is the same Lucia Galvez who would half a century later actually take up the task of editing these diaries for publication. The diary presages the connection between these two women, seeming to map a future project, or rather the continuation of a project of conserving the notebooks for her family. Even those seemingly banal details that the diary inevitably contains might in the future prove important. Delfina describes these notebooks as a family legacy that she would have liked to possess, a way of knowing the past, of relating to her family through the textual archive. The diary here functions again dialogically, stretching the present of writing to the present of copying, to the future present of reading, editing, and eventually publishing. This is the what if of the diary, its gesture toward not only a future self yet to be lived, but also other future selves, readers, family members, yet to emerge on the horizon of subjective possibility. This introductory note is written in one present, 1943, about writing a past life lived that also recognizes possible future readers. Crucially, her entry reminds us that keeping a diary is not only about writing, but also about reading and imagining a reader. If the diary is commonly thought of as a private, intimate space, one in which the diarist enjoys the freedom to write those thoughts reserved for my eyes only, what happens when the writing of the diary is not done exclusively for yourself, but also for others? What happens when the diary is not private, but shared? I have in mind the following passage from Delfina's journal copy. It says, I am in the spirit of Julia, in that of her diary. I've been reading it all day. When I read it, I imagine, without wanting to, and I don't know why, that I am a man, that I am X, that it is he or any of them who is reading this. And I feel as they must feel if they were to read it, what they should understand and love. This is Delfina Bunge writing about reading the diary of her sister, Julia. Importantly, to be in the spirit of her sister implies an empathetic relation not only to the writer, but also to other potential readers. By reading Julia's diary, Delfina contemplates the reactions of others were they also to read it, as she imagines the way that the writer positions herself in relation to them. Here, Delfina shows that the diary can also serve to imagine the self as other. This is a queer process enacted not only by the cross-gender identification of the writer with potential male readers, but also through the strangeness by which this feeling emerges without wanting it to, or understanding why. This is the seductive power of reading the diary, a moment in which the reader, Delfina, identifies as the object of desire of the writer of the text, Julia. For Delfina to be him or any of them, ellos in the masculine, is thus to imagine herself as desired by her sister, on the one hand, and on the other to imagine her feelings as them were they also to read the text. The diary frames the expression of erotic desire between sisters by virtue of its form of address and the particularity of the sisters' practice of both writing and reading each other's diaries. Furthermore, this expression of desire is not written as projection, but the effect of reading. More like an admission than speculation, Delfina describes the link between imagining and feeling as a statement of fact. The diary actually produces this queer feeling between sisters. This is queer kinship. Here, to understand oneself as a sister is to feel desired as and by a sister. For me, queer kinship is a form of orienting the body and its desires through the structural norms that adhere to kinship over time, and yet also question or eschew those norms in order to gesture toward a different form of relationality that may not yet exist. This queerness is found in kinship's incitement to normativity that opens up possibilities for eroding, refashioning, or adapting the norm from within the logics of family. I'm trying to advocate for a more capacious understanding of queerness, one that does not tether itself to a particular subject position or disciplinary logic, but rather exists as the reverberating interface between surfaces, forms, and bodies. This is a potentially erotic orientation that is psychic and corporeal, historical and immediate, uncanny and comforting. By bringing to bear these formal mechanisms on the lived experience of relationality, we can better understand how queerness becomes integrated into the possibility of expressing the self as potential. The Bunge sisters' diaries allow us to view from multiple vantage points the ways in which the self that emerges through the process of writing the diary is mutually constructed by the process of reading as and by the sister. I'm proposing that the experience of self is oriented by the formative properties of the family on the one hand, and the refractive qualities of the diary on the other. Bodies become individuated by virtue of the relationships that the diary frames and makes possible. Julia and Delfina become sisters not only by blood relation, but also by virtue of the relationships that the text allows them to imagine, reproduce, and record. Bodies discover themselves in the flows of the narrative, however fragmentary. Gendered sisters find their gender and their individuality through the psychic prism of the diary. If we can think of the diary not simply as a textual record, but a technology of self-making, then we can begin to understand the contradictions between individual desires and the compulsions of family life, class alliance, and national belonging that emerge through this archive. And the diary and the family album intersect in curious ways. On February 17th, 1901, Julia and her friend Stella Achaval organized a party at the Hotel Eden in La Falda, Córdoba. While Julia's diary does not include an entry for this date, I know this party existed because the day's plan of events, written on hotel letterhead, was fastened to Delfina's diary with a paperclip. And this is a fascinating bit of sort of ephemera that is part of the archival nature of the diary here. So you can see this is the hotel stationery that lists 1 to 7 different events. Most of them are races, different types of races for different age groups. The first activity, though, if you can make it out, says tug of war in English, and then the premio, the prize, is bombones, right, or little chocolates. Okay. On the verso of that plan, there is a drawing that was done and signed Carlos Orsi Kier. This presents a simple question. Why did Delfina choose to fasten this drawing here? The entry in Delfina's diary from 1900 details a ball that Julia attended with their brother Carlos Octavio and their mother Maria Luisa. Delfina did not join them, however, and missed a marvelous evening during which Julia met several handsome Brazilian dignitaries. It may be a coincidence, but I think it is more likely that this drawing illustrates something about Delfina that she wanted to display on that particular evening in October of 1900. The portrait is of Delfina. It suggests a longing gaze that would recur in the carte de visite that Delfina had commissioned during this same time period. Intimate, personal, an ink drawing on the back of a scrap of notebook paper. Its materiality connects Delfina's cultivation of the diary to her representation as a visual object. This particular illustration reveals a sense of desire that also points to the public difference between the two sisters. So a bit about the family album. The family album is another cultural artifact that preserves kinship relations for posterity. As a site of subject formation, it is an indispensable, though seldom studied, expression of the ideologies of family, class, and nation. The album itself, the material object, exposes the constructed nature of kinship as memorialized, and in doing so marks the construction of self as an attempt to reconcile the past with the present, the constitutive temporal gap on which the album depends. The family album is an intimate, disciplinary site, as well as a site of disciplining intimacy, gender, race, and class. Take, for example, a studio portrait from 1905 that evidences Julia Bunge's triumph at a benefit gala, where she won the prize for most artistic hairstyle. The dress and coiffure imitate Sarah Bernhardt's role as Melisande in Edmond Rostand's La Princesse Lointaine. Bernhardt, the celebrity of the turn of the century, playing an ethereal princess longing for love. Julia, the budding socialite, adopting Bernhardt's splendor. Julia's Princess Lointaine is a Creole copy of Sarah Bernhardt. And by this I mean that she engages in a complex procedure of appropriation and excision that focuses on capturing the allure of Europeans' queerness, but also reinforcing the subject's traditional criollo subjectivity. Julia wears a similarly shaped crown and dress. Bernhardt's diamonds are replaced by bauble pearls. The lilies adorning each side retain the same shape, though Julia's crown is softer, more flexible. Julia's dress is cut with a wider neckline and includes sleeves made of tulle. The key elements are all there, and yet Julia's gaze is just a bit off. It's more vulnerable, less sensual than Bernhardt's, whose slightly open mouth and upward gaze offer a pose more cunningly available than Julia's, who gazes rather outward, at a distance, her mouth closed, her chin slightly upturned. She seems somehow too serious, toning down Bernhardt's exuberance. In fact, Julia would write an incisive diary entry about this portrait. Sunday, 11th November of 1905. I have had my portrait taken as Princess Lointaine. The pictures turned out very beautiful and artistic. One, face on, has my head inclined with an expression that is extremely smooth, sad, too sad, very romantic. There's another that I do not like at all. Sadly, it is the one in which I am most like myself. That is my expression, between happy, frank, vain, and arrogant. I do not like that portrait. It makes me suffer. Mom says that it is not distasteful, that it is ridiculous on my part to say that it is also very nice. Julia is reflecting on an image of herself that does not live up to the expectations of a young woman, a niña, in the social circles of the porteño elite. She reflects on it on the internalized limits to self-expression. This is a boundary that she seems to be pushing with her arrogance and vanity, and yet she also expresses an important quality of portraiture. It may reveal something about herself that she would prefer not to display. To pose as Bernhardt is not simply to copy her style, but to summon from history what illusory resonance she creates with her body, her celebrity, in order that Julia might also approximate such an effect in others. In this, Julia's Princess Lointain is an example of the tension between harnessing queerness and suppressing its excess. As a cultural gesture of adoption and adaptation, of yearning for modernity in an era of conflicting political and aesthetic proposals, this pose is a bodily orientation that engages both the desire for recognition as modern and the fleeting gestural proximity between modernity and decadence. In the context of the family album, this particular image can be indexed to Julia's diary, but it also points to a sharp distinction between the two sisters. Julia's pose of celebrity creates a new form of presence, an emanating modernity that is at once desirable and terrifying, painful. Delfina, in contrast, sought a different type of recognition, not for her public figure, but her intelligence, her writing. In almost all of her portraiture, she recedes from the camera. She fades away. While Julia sought the fantasy of European celebrity, Delfina's visual presence is more realist. Her body bears no ornamentation. In this studio portrait, she faces the camera, her hair parted, her mouth closed. This is a shy portrait, one accentuated by the photographic technique in which the whiteness of the frame seems to engulf her. Delfina's face almost floats, disembodied. The shadows of her cheeks and her neck, her eyes, give this image a sincerity that borders on sternness. She represents herself as pensive, withholding a part of herself that she seems to want to express, but cannot. In another studio portrait, probably taken at the same session, we see Delfina in an embroidered white dress, standing, grasping a bouquet. She gazes longingly downward at the small flowers. Her pose is reflexive, as if lost in thought, in the contemplation of such a fragile object. In Delfina's first portrait, she poses in soft focus, and in the second, she approaches the costumbrista style of elegant but reserved young women. This introspection stands in stark contrast with Julia's audacious citational practice. Thus, while Julia was engaged in a deliberately artistic self-representation, Delfina was much closer to the sincerity of realism in her own self-styling. By way of conclusion, this is a photograph of Carlos Octavio's living room. It is annotated by his sister Delfina, and it reads, Sala de Carlos Octavio, casa en que murió. Carlos Octavio's living room, the house in which he died. At first glance, this image registers Carlos Octavio's taste, his choice of fabric, drapery, artwork, his piano. But it also depends on his absence, a room of the house in which he died. Why does Delfina choose this particular point of reference, this parenthetical? While it is possible that this detail is offered as a historical signpost, that is, as an indication to future viewers who may not be familiar with this place of what they are looking at, I think as I described earlier in the book, this is the home that was offered to Delfina by her brother, Carlos Octavio, as an outlet for her artistic pursuits, as a refuge from the demands to marry that she had stridently rejected in her youth. This is the room she could have inhabited, the piano that she could have played. The spectral presence of her brother is conjured by her handwriting, the physical manifestation of her desire to locate him as belonging to this particular image. She too could have belonged to this space, but does so only through absence. But it is only in her brother's death that Delfina is able to insert herself as custodian of a space where she might have resided but did not, to imagine a life that she could have lived but did not. What is this caption doing? It saves for posterity the absence of the presence of a brother who is no longer there. Without this family inscription, how would I, me, or you, the viewer, understand this image? One of the qualities of the family album is that it makes archive out of text, text out of archive. I take the inscription of the fact of a brother's death on the surface of the photograph as meaningful. In concrete terms, the referential quality of the photograph depends on this constitutive lack. Carlos Octavio inhabits this queer space as a spectral presence, a lingering self inscribed by his sister's pen as absent. Finally, we see what Barth calls the spectrum of the photograph, both the spectacle of opulence, of normative domesticity, and the return of the dead. Bunge's specular presence, Carlos Octavio Bunge's specular presence, returns by virtue of Delfina's inscription on the page of the family album, without which the referential duration of the image might be lost. We would not know how to see this room without the inscription, which thus imbues the space with concrete knowledge of both presence and absence. The lingering embodiment of kinship that is enacted by the technology of the family album is manifest by the inscription on the page, which shapes the reach of the family, of the Bunge family. It is a living room haunted by death, a memory of a space of familial relationality that this image becomes a photograph, a register of the spectral presence of kinship that is only visible through the imaginary of kinship imagined, projected, lingering as possible. I think about this too in light of our current moment and how perhaps the family album, like the diary, becomes a site not just of memory making, but of collective care. How we remember, how we grieve, how we care for the fragile objects that remind us not just of what could have been, but of what was and what could be. In that, we harness technologies of kin making to expand the possibilities of belonging. We create queer kinship. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know you can only see little bubbles of us, but this is sort of digital applause for you. Thank you so much for that fabulous presentation. So great. I mean, what I think Joseph and I have spoken about before everybody joined into the room is that feel free to shoot questions via chat. And Joseph, if you want to simply answer the questions or, call on the earlier people to sort of, voice whatever questions they themselves have, I think that would work fabulously. I just want to start it off with one question. Again, thank you for this fabulous talk. I think it was such an honor to sort of see you walk us through your thinking of these intimate objects and traces of this family history that have, entered this personal archive and been, partly left in your care for time being, and it just has gotten me, you know, I've read the book, and seeing you talk and present on it, it just sort of fills me with this excitement about the methods and the project and the ways you're rethinking both the archive, notions of queerness, and the relationship to kinship. So before we open up to other questions, I was wondering if you could, my first question is really sort of around these notions of archival attachments and intimacy, partly in relation to the vulnerabilities that come to be produced by family archives, by family secrets, by, I think, this beautiful tension you work through in the book and in your presentation between, archival absences, that which is shared and that which is left unseen. So my question is about the intimate. So what are the sort of contours and boundaries of the intimate for this project, and especially in terms of using a family archive? And part of what I'm thinking about here is, just as I see you throughout the book, I think productively pushing up against the presumed normativity of the normative family and the constant moments of reimagination and the failures of the normativity of kinship. I'm wondering if we see something similar happening with the presumed proximity of intimacy. Right. So again, a call to kind of think about intimacy in relation to the archive. And I guess my second question is really sort of embedded in there. In terms of your own intimacy with this family archive, with Lucia Galvez, who comes up a lot in the book as an absolutely key figure and shows up in the images and the slideshow you just shared with us all. But how are you yourself implicated in both these archival attachments, intimacies, and also the queer positionalities of yourself as a scholar and researcher, but also in terms of the way you are drawing together and pulling upon this assemblage of texts and images and objects? So
Yeah, I'm going to start with the second one. So let me tell the story of how I came to relate to this particular archive. I narrated a little bit in the book, but part of this came from like sheer luck. I was in Argentina at the National Library, and I was looking for a particular text by Carlos Octavio Bunge that he had written under a pseudonym, and that I had seen people make reference to, but I hadn't ever seen it in a library in the U.S. So I was able to get some funding to go to Argentina, and there I am in the National Library, and I find the book. And while I'm there, I start talking with some other people, and they say, well, you should talk to Lucia Galvez. She's the one that has the archive. And so I was, able to be put in touch with Lucia. And the first time we met, she asked me to meet her for tea at the Club de Progreso, just like a very fancy, like 19th century fancy, like club for members of the elite. And it's not as fancy now as it was then, but it was so awkward and interesting for me that she wanted to talk about her family with me in that space, and it was a sort of testing ground. I had read everything that I could about the family, and so we were just able to gab about her relatives, and she was really, I think, excited to have someone else to talk to about these things. And so then she invited me back to her apartment, and so I came to the apartment another time, and all of these materials are just in a box, a chest in her living room, and it's the diaries and it's the family album. And so she takes out the family album, and we just start looking through the pages, and she's telling me all of the names, and I'm trying to like write everything down so I can remember everything. And I realized that it was a reenactment or an enactment of the very type of relationship that the family album stages, right? When you look at a family album, it's done typically in the space of the home. It's an intimate process, right? Not everyone has access to this. And so she was inviting me into that space, and we were seated together, and we were touching the pages together at the same time. Um, and and that built a sense of trust between us. So later, she allowed me to have some scans of the images so that I could sort of look at them later and order them in kind of a different way. And so I think, I'm implicated in this because I uh, attempt to um, I relate to the archive by being invited into this particular space of Lucia's home, the archivist's home. And while I was there, when we were talking about her family, um, she gave me something as a parting gift, which I didn't realize at the time what it meant, but it was a publication. It was a book of poems that had been written by her daughter, who was also named Delfina, and was named after her grandmother, Delfina Bunge. So the daughter's great great grandmother, and the daughter had committed suicide in the early '90s, I think. And this book of poems, Lucia gave it to me, sort of saying like, there's also this, right? There's also intergenerational work that's been going on here, and I want you to read this. And so the book of poems is devastating. It's really beautiful, and that ended up being the quote that I used to open the book, which is a quote about looking at the family album. So the quote from the family album comes from the book of poems that was written by Delfina's daughter about looking at the family album, or the images, the pictures that are on the wall of that same house that I was in, where I was invited into the family archive, right? So it's like all of these things are really small gestures that build up a sort of that allow me to be implicated in that fabric. And I think that going through that archival process, and that the slowness, I talk about the slowness of that, the process of that research, it sort of allowed me to think a little bit more concretely about what is said and what is left unsaid. Because I think that, getting to your first question, I also keep a diary, sometimes, and I know what it's like to think a thing but not write it. I don't know if any of you connected, have had that feeling too. And I really identified with when Julia was talking about how she started writing her diary. She says, I want it to come out just as I first think it, because if I think about it too much, it'll come out just how I want it to be, right? And so there's something about how intimacy is in allowing yourself to negotiate the multiple selves that already populate your imaginary. And so I think that the secrets, or the gossipy parts, are maybe things that are said, maybe things that are not said, maybe things that we speculate about. And I'll tell one gossipy thing. Okay. So one gossipy thing was when I was when I was in Argentina and at this first meeting with Lucia at the Club de Progreso, I was like kind of tiptoeing around the fact that Carlos Octavio was a lifelong bachelor, that he was sort of like rumored to be a homosexual, and she just sort of like came out with it and was like, "Oh yeah, like he was gay," and I was like not expecting that. She was a very well put together woman, and I sort of had a presumption of how she was going to relate to that. And you know, while I was there, so she's talking about him sort of openly as homosexual. There are some other historians that I write about, Cárdenas and Padilla, who also describe him as homosexual. And so at one time I was talking with them, and I started asking about, like, well, what is the evidence that people have to describe Carlos Octavio as homosexual, because there's no archive of that, right? Me as a literary critic, like, I can read queerly, I can queer that archive, but there's no sort of documentation that points to any sort of like identification of self. But Cardenas was saying, well, there was this one time when supposedly Carlos Octavio was on a boat and he was traveling across to Montevideo with someone, and they got caught. And I was like, oh my gosh, tell me about this, right? And it's not, like, there's nothing about that I find particularly relevant to the way that I'm reading this archive. But it is a thing that attaches itself. It's an intimate detail that attaches itself to the life of Carlos Octavio in the absence of any archival evidence. So I tried to think about that, like, and to be honest with how that conversation came about, and how, we can read into the archive these things without necessarily presuming an identity formation, which is something that, would be ahistorical and sort of betray, like, the actual lived experience of this person. To call Carlos Octavio homosexual may not, it doesn't sit right with me, but he certainly was a figure that was disruptive of people's expectations. And if we want to call that queer, then he is a queer figure, right? But identity formation and things like that are a different thing altogether. So that's sort of like one example where the stickiness of queerness attaches itself to the silences that are left behind. Yeah.
Thank you. That was such a fabulously eloquent response to my question. Yeah, it was really beautiful to hear you sort of walk us through that. So I have never done a webinar like this with 45 to 50 people. I see a couple of people have thrown, if you sort of scroll up, Joseph, you'll see Sophia left a fabulous question. If you are interested in kind of reading that, and then there's a comment from Nancy Legreca down at the bottom. And then maybe after that, people can just sort of either jump in or just shoot a text message, or however we go about this.
Okay, so Sophia, hi Sophia, I'm so glad to see you. So the question here is about Delfina's diary and how she literally cut and pasted one passage from one place to another, paired with the statement that the transcription is an act of violence, that her transcribing her own diary is an act of violence. In conversation with the idea of a corpus or a body of work, is this a violence against the body of work in some sense, or a textual mutilation, and what is the effect of that violence? I mean, I think that's a really beautifully put question. The way that so in the material diary, Delfina writes on a couple different places, annotates what she's doing, and so there'll be a page that says 1943. I'm copying this and that. So far, I've done about 5,000 pages, and I've got a whole lot more to go. And I think that, she contemplated this, the body of work, the volume of work, as something that, if she didn't necessarily want to be published explicitly, she certainly considered the possibility that it would be public. Otherwise, why go through the process of organizing it into chronological volumes for posterity in that way? And I think, it also points to an effort of perhaps censorship. We don't know if she did copy everything word for word. Her husband, Manuel Galvez, writes in his own literary memoirs that she didn't copy everything word for word, and that she left out parts that were unbecoming of a person of their station. So I think that it's certainly possible that there's a body of work that she is redoing, and this is why I think of it more in terms of a palimpsest than a replacement, because the original diary always interrupts or erupts, right? Intervenes in the process of copying. And I think that for her, it's sort of a psychic violence to relive. And that psychic violence is potentially assuaged by not having to copy certain portions, by just cutting them and gluing them. But I think that, in terms of like a textual mutilation, I think that's one way that you could look at it. I think that it could also be seen as more of a transformation, right? Turning one original manuscript diary into something else. That's like the cuadernos copia are not the same as an original manuscript diary. They're another thing that I haven't quite seen replicated in other places. Yeah. Okay. Nancy, you know that I would love to talk to you about tea, over tea at the Club de Progreso anytime. And I have, okay. Can I speak about the relationship of private diary making to public record keeping in terms of materiality and history? Okay. Thanks, Jordana. I think that, so it is a fairly unique process by which the sisters socialize their intimate work, their diaries. Now, in terms of how does that relate to public record keeping or publicity, the sisters also published a lot. And Delfina, in particular, was a very accomplished essayist and memoirist. And one of the things that I look at in the book as well is a project that they undertook together, the two sisters, which was a series of textbooks for like second, third, fourth, fifth grade children. And in that, you see a stark contrast between what they are prescribing for the public and what they are then documenting as private. So there's a way in which genre matters quite a bit for what people are saying and how they're going about saying it, which is kind of why I organized the book around genres. So in the diaries, we see this sort of queerness, and then, oh, okay, right. I'm going to period on that, and then women in particular as archives book and the training women period. Okay. Okay, so Lucia Galvez, the archivist who I relate to, and I who is the archivist that I work with for this book. She's a trained historian, and she has published several books of history about Argentina. So she has the training for that, and also the interest in, I think, also maintaining the good name of the family for posterity. I think it's not disinterested in that sense, and I think there's also quite a bit of nostalgia for a period in which her family was part of the elite, and they're not quite in that position anymore. Certain parts of the family are. There's a multi-million-dollar company called Bunge, which is a grain export company that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It's $1 billion company, but they're not at the elite is not what it was. The elite now is not what it was, and this moment is what David Bunges calls the apogee of the elite. And I think that Lucia is well aware of that, and is interested in preserving that particular moment in which everything was glamorous and splendorous for members of her family. But she also has like the specific training for that.
Can I just like quick, Joseph, just to jump in with the question of the archiving? I mean, one of the things that I see lay out in the introduction to your book so fabulously is the fact that so many of these records end up in your hands, and the challenge to kind of enter them into an actual archive or to digitize them comes up as well. So I'm curious if you could tell us just a little bit about those challenges, in light of what you had just said in response to Jordana's question about the relationship to archive and history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I want to also recognize that my parents have signed on. Hello, Randy and Kathy. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I actually, you can yeah. I asked about sort of the digitization and the challenges, but we can maybe come back to that because there's so many other good questions popping up here. So a question from Liam before Jordana's last comments.
How much the idea of intimacy mined from diaries and portraits from the social status of aristocrats, queer intimacy of sister desiring sister as a subtle narcissism in portraiture as an internalized effort to uphold the regarded status. I mean, so Liam, thank you for that question. I think that, if you look carefully at the diaries, you see how the sisters craft space for themselves in public in very different ways. Julia is all about the galas and the balls and the dresses and the crowns and the glamour. She's all about it. Delfina, in contrast, doesn't want to be seen in public, doesn't want people to look at her. She wants people to regard her as a writer, and she was she was someone who Victoria Ocampo eventually sought advice from about becoming a public writer, and they exchanged a series of letters, which are compiled in Ocampo's Testimonios. And because Delfina was a few years older than Victoria. And so, the reflection of self, I think, takes different forms for the two sisters, and the diary becomes a place where that difference is manifest. I think that the style with which they craft the self, both in the diary and in their portraiture, also is evidence of this difference. That's something I tried to mark with the glamour of Julia's portraiture versus the sort of the subtlety and even the sort of fading away that we see in Delfina's, which I think would allow us to move to a question about Sarah Bernhardt. Okay. Queer kinship. Okay. Julia's Creole copy of the French actress Sarah Bernhardt, but also think about Delfina's first poems and books in French, right? Do you see some of these international kinships in the diaries? So the connection to France for the sisters was that, oh, actually, I think this is, okay. If we pause, I'll show you guys something really, really cool. So one thing that I don't get to show many people is that one of the things that Lucia asked me if I wanted to borrow was a little book that looks like this. And when you open it, you realize that it is the report card for French class for the two sisters. And so you see here that this is from 1894, and it has the ways in which they are graded for conduct, conduit, application, politesse, order, distinction, and absences. It's signed by their mother most of the time, and sometimes by their father, Octavio, who was a Supreme Court justice. This one is signed by their father, Octavio, from 1895. So the two sisters were enrolled in French class from very early. And Julia, at one point, sort of complains about Delfina's French, but Delfina spoke perfect French. And her first essay that she wrote was published in French under a pseudonym for the French magazine Femina, for which she won a prize that caused a scandal in the family. And I call that, what do I call that? El caso Delfina, right? In which a letter arrives to the family congratulating them that one of their daughters had won a prize in a literary competition, which was extremely taboo. A woman writer was not acceptable for members of the elite. And so to write in French was a way of assuaging that. To publish it under a pseudonym was another way of assuaging that. And it also marks the elevation of the French, of the Argentine elite, right? To write in French was something that allowed Delfina to communicate with Victoria Ocampo precisely. They wrote to each other in French as well. And her first books of poetry, Delfina's first books of poetry, were published in French and later translated to Spanish by Alfonsina Storni, for example. So there are transatlantic connections. This is part of the tour of the elite. When Delfina married Manuel Galvez, they went on a year-long honeymoon. Carlos Octavio was sent by the Buenos Aires city government to study European school systems in 1900. So they were familiar with Europe, and that was part of the sort of the way that they demonstrated their culture, right, as international and as transatlantic. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just echoing. So many people are saying that they are very excited to read the book, and I just want to put in a pitch. I mean, it is really a fabulous book, and it's gotten me sort of thinking in such, creative and I think provocative ways about queer kinship and how it is sutured to the notion of the family and whatnot. So, yeah.
Let me do one thing more. Hold on. Okay. You guys, look. If you guys, want the book, it's on sale right now. It's on sale at SUNY, press. 30% off the paperback, 50% off the hardcover. The hardcover is really expensive. Don't get the hardcover, get the paperback. Just saying. Okay. Okay. So, wait, okay.
Yeah, and I was just wondering. I mean, if I'm just so blown away by the fact that you have this late 19th century report card in your hands, and if you could just tell us a little bit about the the archival materials that you yourself ended up with, and what are some of the challenges? Are you? I know in the intro to the book, you sort of lay out the fact that you wanted to digitize a lot of these. There are all sorts of structural and kind of financial challenges to doing that, which clearly relate to the very constitution of archives themselves. And at some point is the idea that these materials will go back to the Bunge family archive, or might they be archived at CUNY or Yale or Stony Brook or elsewhere?
If you got some money and want to help me digitize the archive, then let me know, because I have applied for different types of funding in different ways. Like, essentially, when I left Argentina, the last time I had a long conversation with Lucia, she took 4 of the diary books, and handed them to me along with a couple smaller things, and said, take these, borrow them, take them to the United States, where I'm sure you'll have better luck digitizing them. I thought, maybe, we'll see. And I came back, and this isn't to, to speak ill of my institution, but at Stony Brook, the library doesn't have the equipment to digitize these types of fragile archives. Because the archives are not already part of a holding at an institution, it's difficult to apply for funding to then digitize them. It's been a really difficult challenge. Also, sort of, I prioritized writing the book and finishing the book over writing grants to get funding to digitize this. I mean, that's an honest answer to that. But at this point, while I've been in quarantine, one of the things that I have imagined is trying to digitize or to take photographs of the books and digitize them myself. I don't know that that's the right thing to do either, because I don't have the sort of software to do a proper job of indexing and all the rest of it. So I think I'm in a weird limbo with the archive that I have right now. and I shouldn't keep it indefinitely. It doesn't belong to me, and it needs to go back to Argentina. One of the problems with that too is that Lucia is not in good health, and since I haven't been able to speak with her recently, and it's been more than a year actually, and she's not doing well, and so there's been a breakdown in communication there, and so I'm in a bit of a difficult spot with that, sort of a holding pattern, I guess. But I'm interested in trying to figure out a way to make these archives more accessible to more people, because otherwise it's like, I'm the only one that can do anything with this stuff, and that's not the point. So I'm interested in trying to figure out creative ways to expand access to these. I think that Delfina's diaries are fantastic and fantastically rich archive that more people can get a lot out of. Yeah,
that's great. So great. So it looks like from Pato, there's maybe one final question here.
Yeah. Queer kinship, curating and organizing work. So this is a good question to end on. When I first started doing work on this book, one of the things that I realized was that queer studies has very often described alternatives to normativity as the ideal subject of queer theory or queer studies. And as I delved deeper into this particular archive, I realized that it was challenging preconceived notions, the expectations that I had, what these people, this very normative, very white supremacist, normative, patriarchal family had to say about gender, desire, and longing, because it was say. And I realized that we discount the queerness embedded within normativity at our own peril. And it is in fact the refusal or the lack of interest that queer studies has shown in normativity itself that has led to some of the gaps, I think, that we're seeing. And I don't think that we need to let the normative off the hook. I don't think we need to divert our eyes from the normative or our critique from the normative, but rather what I learned by doing this process, it's 7:00, people are banging pots and pans. What I learned was to hone in on the normative family as a productive site of queerness. In fact, it is the productive site of queerness, not the alternatives to the normative family. The normative family itself is a producer of queerness. And that, for me, is the overarching gesture that I'm trying to make with the book. Yeah. That's what I'd say to that, Pato. Thank you for that.
Fabulous. Well, this is so wonderful, and I want to thank you, Joseph, for again talking to us about your fabulous book. If you maybe want to put up again the screenshot for the discount code, and feel free if anybody wants to take a screenshot of that. But it really is, it's just a wonderful book, and I love the way you sort of walk us through, the finding of the materials, your effective and methodological engagement with them, and thank you so much again. So it's really awkward to do a digital round of applause, but I would like to give Joseph one of those. Thank you so much. And I think that sort of concludes our meeting, though I will keep the people filter out if anybody wants to stick around. I'll be here for a few more minutes, and maybe Joseph can stick around as well for
Yeah,
a
I
few
can stick
minutes.
around. Thank you so much.